Leo Vance had spent his entire life believing he came from nothing, a man built from calluses, silence, and the kind of dignity only hardship can teach. But everything he thought he knew shattered the moment an expensive envelope landed in his hands. Inside it wasn't money or opportunity, but a message that detonated the truth he had buried his whole life regarding your biological father. From that instant, Leo was pulled into a world of marble floors, cold stares, and a billionaire dying with secrets burning on his tongue. Yet the real danger wasn't the inheritance he never wanted. It was the storm waiting behind those mansion doors, because someone there would rather destroy him than let the truth about his mother ever come to light. And as Leo takes his first step into that empire, he has no idea he's walking straight into a war he never asked for, but was born to finish. For 38 years, Leo Vance's life was measured in calluses and quiet routines, a world where the richest man he knew was the one who owned the local hardware store. He had no idea his real father measured his life in billions of dollars. His existence was a carefully constructed fortress built on the foundation of a simple, painful belief. He had been abandoned, discarded. A story started and finished before he could even understand the words. This belief was the ghost in his small apartment, the silent companion on his long walks home from the construction site, the hollow ache behind the pride he felt in his self-sufficiency. He was a man defined by a quiet resilience, a deep-seated empathy for the overlooked, and a cautious mistrust of anything that seemed too easy. His world was his tight-knit, working-class neighborhood, the scent of sawdust on his clothes, and the warm gratitude in the eyes of Mrs. Gable, his elderly neighbor whose groceries he carried up 3 flights of stairs every Tuesday. It was a modest life, but it was his. He had built it with his own 2 hands, and in that he found a fragile peace. That peace was shattered on a Tuesday afternoon, not by a bang, but by the crisp, tearing sound of an expensive envelope. It arrived via a courier in a sleek black car that looked alien parked on his gritty street, a vehicle worth more than every car on the block combined. The envelope itself was an object of suspicion. It was thick, creamy cardstock, impossibly white against his work-stained hands. His name and address were printed in elegant, embossed lettering. It wasn't a bill. It wasn't junk mail. It felt important. And in Leo's life, things that were important were usually bad news. He opened it with the edge of a butter knife, his heart thudding with a low, anxious rhythm. The letterhead was from a law firm, Sterling, Croft and Finch, a name that dripped with old money and corporate power. It was a summons, a polite but unyielding request for his presence to discuss a matter of significant personal and financial importance. The matter concerned the estate of a Mr. Alistair Finch. Leo had never heard the name. He almost threw the letter away, convinced it was a bizarre mistake, a scam targeting the wrong person. But below the typed name was a handwritten note from the lawyer, regarding your biological father. The words seemed to vibrate on the page. Biological father. 2 words that had been a void his entire life, a blank space he had learned not to look at. The shock was a physical blow, a cold wave that washed over him, leaving disbelief and anger in its wake. After a lifetime of deafening silence, why now? He crumpled the letter, his knuckles white. He wouldn't go. It was a cruel joke, a trap, a twisted game being played by people from a world he didn't belong to and didn't want to. He threw the balled-up paper towards the trash can, but it missed, landing starkly white against the worn linoleum floor. All evening, it sat there, a silent accusation. He tried to ignore it, to lose himself in the familiar comfort of making dinner for Mrs. Gable. But the gnawing, lifelong question echoed louder than ever. It wasn't about money. He had never craved wealth or a vast fortune. It was about the one question that had shaped his entire identity. Why? Why had he been left behind? The next day, Against every self-protective instinct he had, Leo found himself standing in a lobby of polished marble and hushed whispers, a world away from the concrete and noise of his own. The law office of Sterling, Croft and Finch occupied the top 3 floors of a glass skyscraper that pierced the clouds. He felt like an intruder, his worn work boots clumsy on the gleaming floors. A lawyer, a man whose suit probably cost more than Leo's monthly rent, led him into a conference room with a breathtaking view of the city. The lawyer, Mr. Sterling, was calm, professional, and spoke in measured tones that offered no comfort. He got straight to the point. Alistair Finch was not just Leo's father, he was the Alistair Finch, the legendary tycoon, the billionaire investor whose name was synonymous with staggering success, a man who had built an empire from a single shrewd investment in the stock market decades ago, a man whose personal net worth was a dizzying figure, a vast collection of assets, real estate, and a controlling interest in a global corporation. He was a titan of industry, and he was in the final stages of a terminal illness. He had weeks, maybe a month, left to live, and his final wish was to see the son he had never known. Leo listened, his face a mask of stone. The words washed over him: billionaire, inheritance, estate, but they were just noise. The only thing he heard was the confirmation of his own story. A powerful man had a son he didn't want, and only now, at the end of his life, was he looking to clear his conscience. A wave of pure, cold rage, decades in the making, rose in his chest. "No," Leo said, his voice quiet but firm. "I'm not interested." He stood up to leave. He wanted no part of this deathbed theater, no piece of the man's immense capital or business empire. He wanted nothing. Mr. Sterling didn't seem surprised. "He anticipated you might feel this way," the lawyer said calmly. "He is not asking for forgiveness, Mr. Vance. He is offering you the one thing he knows he owes you." Leo paused at the door, his back to the lawyer. And what's that?" he asked, his voice laced with cynicism. "His money? His name?" Mr. Sterling's reply cut through the anger and hit the raw nerve of Leo's lifelong wound. "The truth," the lawyer said, "the truth about your mother." Those words hung in the air, heavier than any mention of a vast fortune or a staggering inheritance. Money was an abstract concept, a number with too many zeros to mean anything real. But his mother, she was the missing chapter of his entire life, the source of the ache that had never fully healed. The truth about her was a currency Leo couldn't refuse. He slowly turned back from the door, his hand falling from the handle. He looked at the lawyer, the anger in his eyes replaced by a weary, desperate resolve. "When?" he asked, his voice rough. The journey to the Finch estate was like crossing into another country, a sleek, silent town car. Sent by the lawyer, carried him out of the city, away from the familiar grid of streets and into the rolling green hills of the countryside where the super-rich hid their lives behind ancient trees and stone walls. The car passed through a set of massive, wrought-iron gates that opened without a sound, gliding up a driveway that seemed to stretch for a mile. The house wasn't a house. It was a monument. A sprawling stone mansion that looked less like a home and more like a museum dedicated to the power of capital and the accumulation of immense wealth. When the driver opened his door, the silence was the first thing that struck him. It was a heavy, unnatural quiet, broken only by the crunch of his boots on the gravel. The air smelled different here, cleaner, scented with manicured flowers and old money. The front door was opened by a butler who looked at Leo's simple jacket and worn jeans with an expression of polite, practiced neutrality. He was led into a grand foyer where the floor was a dizzying expanse of black and white marble. The ceiling soared 2 stories high, and a colossal crystal chandelier hung like a frozen waterfall of light. It was a gilded cage, breathtakingly beautiful and utterly cold. Voices echoed faintly from a nearby room. As he was led towards them, He passed walls adorned with portraits, generations of stern-faced Finches captured in oil paint, their gazes following him with silent judgment. And then he saw them. Standing by a fireplace large enough to roast an ox were a woman and a younger man. The woman was elegance personified, her silver hair perfectly coiffed, her posture ramrod straight in a silk dress the color of cream. This was his stepmother. The young man beside her, his stepbrother, was her mirror image in male form, arrogant, handsome in a cruel way, and wearing a smirk that seemed permanently etched on his face. "So, this is him," the woman said, her voice like the chime of ice in a crystal glass. She didn't offer a hand, only a dismissive once-over that catalogued his lack of pedigree in a single, sweeping glance. "I'm Eleanor," she stated, as if announcing a brand name. "And this is my son, Preston." Preston's smirk widened. "Come for your piece of the inheritance, have you? Can't say I blame you. It's a lot of dollars to leave on the table." Leo ignored him, his focus turning as the butler announced, "Mr. Finch will see you now." He was led into a vast study lined with thousands of leather-bound books. The room smelled of old paper, polish, and medicine. And there, in a large leather wingback chair modified with medical equipment, sat Alistair Finch. The titan of industry was gone. In his place was a frail, sallow-skinned old man, his body lost in a silk dressing gown, a thin blanket covering his lap. Tubes ran discreetly from beneath the blanket to a quiet, humming machine. Only his eyes held a remnant of his former power. They were sharp, intelligent, and filled with a regret so profound it was almost a physical presence in the room. "Leo," Alistair said, his voice a dry rasp. "You came." The meeting was strained. A painful dance around a lifetime of unspoken questions. Alistair spoke of his regrets, of his weakness as a young man, but his words were vague, heavy with the things he wasn't saying. Before Leo could press for the real truth, for the story of his mother, Eleanor and Preston entered the room, their presence shattering the fragile connection. "Alistair, darling, you're tiring yourself," Eleanor cooed, placing a hand on his shoulder. Perhaps we should get to the point. Settle things." Alistair sighed, a flicker of something annoyance, defeat, crossing his face. He nodded towards a small, lacquered box on the desk beside him. Preston stepped forward and opened the box. Inside, resting on a bed of velvet, was a check. He plucked it out and held it up for Leo to see. It was a cashier's check, made out to Leo Vance. The amount was $10 million. "My father is a generous man," Preston said, his voice dripping with condescension. "He wants to make sure you're taken care of. A settlement, you could call it, for your trouble. All you have to do is sign a simple document, waiving any future claims to the estate or the family name, and walk away." It was a trap, a test, a transactional dismissal of his entire existence. They weren't offering a connection. They were trying to buy his silence, to erase him with a pile of cash. Leo looked from the check to the icy face of his stepmother, to the smug grin of his stepbrother, and finally to the tired, waiting eyes of his father. In that moment, the rage he'd felt in the lawyer's office returned, cold and clear. He took a slow breath. "I didn't come here for your money," he said, his voice quiet but echoing with dignity in the silent room. He met Alistair's gaze directly. "I don't want your fortune. I don't want your assets. I came for the truth you promised me, the truth about my mother. That's all I want. You can keep your dollars." A stunned silence fell over the room. Preston's jaw tightened in fury. Eleanor's polite mask cracked, revealing a flash of pure venom. But on Alistair Finch's face, for the first time, a faint, unmistakable look of respect appeared. He had failed their test, and in doing so, passed his father's. As the butler stiffly escorted a silent Leo back towards the front door, he glanced once more at the gallery of portraits lining the grand hallway. He saw Alistair as a young man, Eleanor in her wedding dress. Preston as a boy on a pony. But in the long, silent gallery of the Finch lineage, there was a conspicuous void, a blank space where a face should have been, his mother's. There were portraits of distant cousins and forgotten uncles, but the woman who had given the dying billionaire his firstborn son had been completely erased from the family's history. It was as if she had never existed. This cold, deliberate omission was more insulting than any check they could have offered. It was a declaration that she, and by extension he, had never mattered. The faint glimmer of respect he had seen in his father's eyes meant nothing to Eleanor and Preston. To them, his defiance was not a sign of character, but an act of war, and they responded with the ruthless efficiency of seasoned corporate raiders. 2 days later, Leo woke up to find his face plastered on the cover of every tabloid at the supermarket checkout. The billionaire's bastard, long-lost son, comes crawling for his inheritance, one headline screamed. Another, more lurid one, featured a grainy photo of him leaving the Finch estate. Captioned, "Conman's Payday. How a construction worker plans to steal a dying man's fortune." The stories were a masterclass in character assassination. Anonymous, family friends, were quoted, painting him as a manipulative opportunist, a grifter who had timed his appearance perfectly to prey on a sick, vulnerable man. They twisted his quiet life into a narrative of failure and resentment, his refusal of the $10 million not as an act of dignity, but as a shrewd negotiating tactic to get his hands on the entire Finch capital. The attack was surgical and devastating. His world, once small and private, was now a public spectacle. The fallout was immediate. When he showed up for work, his boss, a man he'd known for 10 years, pulled him aside with a pained expression. "Leo, I'm sorry," he said, avoiding his eyes. "The owners, this media attention, it's not good for business. We have to let you go." He was fired not for any wrongdoing, but for the crime of existing. His neighbors, who once greeted him with a friendly wave, now looked at him with a mixture of awe and suspicion. Whispers followed him down the hallway. He was no longer just Leo, the guy who helped Mrs. Gable with her groceries. He was the gold digger from the news. He was completely isolated. The quiet life he had so carefully built now lying in ruins around him. Just as he hit rock bottom, feeling the full weight of the Finch family's power crashing down on him, a crack of light appeared. A small, unassuming car pulled up outside his apartment building one evening. An older woman with kind, worried eyes got out. He recognized her instantly. She had been a housekeeper at the estate, a silent presence in the background. Her name was Maria. She clutched a worn canvas bag to her chest as if it contained state secrets. "Mr. Vance," she said, her voice a low, urgent whisper. "I shouldn't be here. If they knew—" She didn't need to finish. "I knew your mother," she continued, her eyes welling with tears. "I worked for the family back then, when I was just a girl. She was a good woman, a kind soul. What they did to her and what they're doing to you now, it's a sin." From her bag, she pulled a small bundle of letters, tied together with a faded silk ribbon. These were hers. "I saved them. I thought she might come back for them one day. She never did. You should have them. You should know the truth." That night, under the dim light of his kitchen lamp, Leo untied the ribbon and carefully unfolded the brittle, yellowed pages. The handwriting was delicate, a graceful cursive that spoke of a gentle spirit. As he read, the entire foundation of his life crumbled and reformed. The letters were from his mother, written to Alistair decades ago. They weren't letters of anger or abandonment. They were filled with love, hope, and heartbreak. She wrote of her deep, genuine love for Alistair, of her excitement about their unborn child, of her dreams for their future. Then the tone changed. She wrote of Alistair's parents, the powerful, prejudiced patriarch, and his equally ruthless wife. They saw her as an unacceptable stain on their pristine family name, a girl from a poor background with no connections. unworthy of their son and the vast wealth he was set to inherit. The letters detailed a cruel, systematic campaign to drive her away. Threats, intimidation, and finally, a devastating lie. Alistair had chosen his family's business empire over her. They had forced him to end it, and he, young and terrified of his domineering father, had caved. She hadn't abandoned her son. She had been driven away, heartbroken and alone, forced into a life of silence to protect the child they had threatened to take from her. The pain in Leo's chest was immense, but it was a different kind of pain now. The lifelong ache of feeling unwanted was replaced by the hot, sharp fury of injustice. His quest was no longer about finding answers for himself. It was about reclaiming the story of a woman who had been silenced, a mother who had been erased. His fight now had a new name: justice. His phone rang the next morning. It was a distraught Maria. "I'm so sorry," she sobbed. "Mrs. Finch, she found out I spoke to you. She fired me. After 30 years, she just threw me out." Eleanor had cut off his only ally, slamming the door to the past shut. But it was too late. She had no idea that she hadn't just slammed a door. She had handed Leo the key. The news of Maria's dismissal landed like a punch to the gut. Leo felt a surge of guilt, realizing his quest for truth had cost a kind, innocent woman her livelihood after 30 years of loyal service. Eleanor hadn't just fired a housekeeper, she had punished an ally, sending a clear and brutal message. Anyone who helped Leo would be destroyed. This act of casual cruelty solidified his resolve. The fight was no longer just for his mother's memory. It was for Maria, for every person the Finches had crushed under the weight of their immense wealth and power. As the third week began, Alistair Finch's health took a sharp, decisive turn for the worse. The news, filtered through sterile press releases from the family's PR team, spoke of him resting comfortably. But Leo knew it was a lie. He called the estate daily, his calls always intercepted by a polite but firm assistant. He drove out to the gates, only to be met by security guards who had been given his photo and explicit instructions not to let him on the property. Eleanor had used her husband's decline to seize absolute control, locking the gilded cage from the inside. The official reason was that Leo's presence was a source of unnecessary stress for the dying man. The real reason was to run out the clock, to ensure Alistair died before any more truths could be shared, before the will could be changed, before the son could connect with the father. Locked out and desperate, Leo paced his small apartment like a trapped animal. The letters were a comfort, but they were also a torment, a story without an ending. He felt time slipping through his fingers, the chance for a final confrontation, for a moment of true reckoning, disappearing with every breath his father took. One evening, sitting in the dark, his hand instinctively went to the small, cool object he always wore around his neck, tucked under his shirt. It was a locket, a simple, silver oval, tarnished with age. It was the only thing his mother had left him, placed in his bassinet at the orphanage. It had been his one constant, a physical link to a ghost. He had opened it 1,000 times. Inside were 2 empty frames, waiting for pictures that were never taken. But that night, fueled by a frantic need for one more clue, he examined it with an intensity he never had before. He ran his thumb over the intricate floral engraving on the front, a pattern of a single, unique rose. He pressed on the clasp, the hinge, the edges. Nothing, it was just a locket. Defeated, he was about to put it away when his finger caught on a tiny, almost invisible seam along the decorative rim. His heart skipped a beat. Using his thumbnail, he pried at it. With a faint click, a false back popped open, revealing a hidden compartment no bigger than a dime. And nestled inside, on a bed of faded velvet, was a tiny, ornate key. It was impossibly small, more decorative than functional, with a head shaped into the same unique rose as the locket's engraving. And then he remembered Maria's words. spoken in a hushed tone as she described the estate. She had mentioned Alistair's private study, a sanctuary no one was allowed to enter, not even Eleanor, a room he kept locked with a special key, a key his own father had given him, one with a small rose on it. A jolt went through Leo. This was it. This was the key she had handed him, not just the letters, but the literal key to the truth. The plan was insane, a risk that could land him in prison. He was already a pariah, a supposed con man. Getting caught breaking into the estate would prove every lie they had ever told about him. But what choice did he have? He had to get back inside. Under the cover of a moonless, rainy night, he put his plan into action. He parked a mile down the road and approached the estate from the woods at the back, a part of the sprawling property far from the main gate and its security cameras. Soaked and shivering, he scaled a section of the stone wall, dropping silently onto the manicured lawn. The mansion was a dark behemoth, only a few lights glowing in the distance. He moved through the shadows of the formal gardens, his heart pounding against his ribs, until he reached the French doors of the library that led to the wing containing the study. He worked the lock with a piece of wire from his toolkit, his hands surprisingly steady. The lock clicked open, and he slipped inside, into the oppressive silence of the house. He navigated through the dark, cavernous rooms, the ghosts of the Finch family watching him from their portraits. He found the study door just as Maria had described it. He slid the tiny key into the lock. It was a perfect fit. With a soft click, the door opened. The study was not like the rest of the house. It was personal, filled with books that were actually read, with maps pinned to a corkboard, with half-finished models of yachts. It smelled of leather and his father's faint, lingering scent of pipe tobacco and sickness. Leo wasn't looking for a will or financial documents. He was looking for a diary. More letters, a photograph, anything that would tell him more about his mother. He ran his hands over the spines of books, opened desk drawers. Nothing. Frustrated, he leaned against a heavy oak bookshelf. As his weight shifted, he heard a faint, grinding sound. A section of the bookshelf receded slightly, revealing the dark metal door of a wall, safe hidden behind it. The door was ajar, not fully closed. His father, in his illness, must have forgotten to lock it. Holding his breath, Leo pulled it open. Inside, he didn't find jewels or stacks of cash. He found ledgers, meticulously kept financial records that went back years. He pulled one out and opened it on the desk. What he saw made the air leave his lungs. It was a second set of books for the Finch Corporation. The pages detailed a complex web of shell corporations and offshore accounts. He saw huge sums of money, millions of dollars, being siphoned from the main company's capital, disguised as consulting fees, service charges, and investments in phantom businesses. And the signatures authorizing these massive transfers, repeated on page after page, were always the same: Eleanor Finch and Preston Finch. It was a systematic plundering of the Finch fortune, a slow, methodical bleeding of the company's assets while the patriarch grew too ill to notice. The sheer scale of the betrayal was staggering. They weren't just protecting their inheritance, they were actively stealing it, draining the very capital that gave them their power. Leo stood frozen, the heavy ledger in his hands feeling like a bomb. This changed everything. This was a crime, a federal offense. This was the leverage he needed, the weapon that could bring their entire corrupt world crashing down. He was so absorbed in the damning figures that he didn't hear the faint creak of a floorboard in the hall. He didn't notice the silent turn of the doorknob. The first sign that he was no longer alone was the sudden, blinding flood of light as the overhead chandeliers were switched on. Leo flinched, his eyes struggling to adjust. A figure stood in the doorway, silhouetted against the bright hallway. "Well, well, well," a familiar, condescending voice drawled. "Look what the cat dragged in." It was Preston. He stood there, arms crossed, a look of theatrical shock on his face that didn't quite reach his cold, triumphant eyes. He saw the open safe, the ledger in Leo's hands, and his smirk widened into a predatory grin. The trap had been sprung. "I can't believe it," Preston said, his voice now loud enough for anyone in the vicinity to hear. "Breaking and entering, theft. I knew you were scum, but this is a new low, even for you." "You know exactly what this is," Leo said, his voice low and steady. His mind racing, he held up the ledger. "It's over, Preston. I found your secret little piggy bank." Preston laughed, a short, ugly sound. "My piggy bank? It looks to me like you broke into my father's private study to steal sensitive financial documents, trying to find something to blackmail us with. How pathetic." He took a step into the room and raised his voice to a shout. "Security! Security! In here! Now! We have an intruder!" Leo's blood ran cold. He realized with sickening clarity that he had walked right into their hands. He was a trespasser. He had broken in, and he was holding what looked like stolen company property. Every action he had taken, every move driven by a desperate search for truth, had just become the perfect evidence for their frame-up. Heavy footsteps thundered down the hall. Two large men in professional security uniforms burst into the room, their faces grim. They saw Preston, pointing a trembling, accusatory finger. They saw Leo standing by the open safe, holding a corporate ledger. The scene was perfectly, damningly staged. "He broke in through the library," Preston said, his voice shaking with feigned outrage. "He was trying to rob the safe. My father is on his deathbed, and this vulture is trying to steal from him." "That's a lie," Leo started, but the security guards were already moving, flanking him. "Sir, I'm going to have to ask you to put the book down and place your hands behind your back," the first guard said, his voice flat and devoid of emotion. Leo looked from the guard's impassive face to Preston's victorious sneer. There was no one to appeal to. There was no one who would believe him. Here, in this house, he was the outsider, the con man, the criminal. He had been so focused on the past, on his mother's story, that he hadn't seen the far more immediate danger right in front of him. He slowly placed the ledger on the desk, the proof of their guilt that was now being used as proof of his. The cold steel of handcuffs clicked around his wrists. The injustice was a physical weight, crushing the air from his lungs. He was being arrested for a crime they had committed. As they led him out of the study, past the silent, judging portraits of the Finch ancestors, he saw Eleanor standing at the end of the hall, wrapped in a silk robe, a small, satisfied smile on her lips. They had won. He wasn't just a social pariah anymore. In the eyes of the law, with the full, terrifying weight of the Finch family's legal team about to descend upon him, he was now a felon. The cold, sterile environment of the police station holding cell was a stark contrast to the opulent prison of the Finch estate. The smell of disinfectant and despair clung to the air. Leo sat on a hard bench, the metallic chill of the handcuffs still a ghost on his wrists. He replayed the scene in the study over and over, each detail a fresh twist of the knife. Preston's feigned shock, Eleanor's triumphant smile, the mechanical efficiency of his own downfall. He had walked into their world seeking a story and had been cast as the villain in theirs. The full weight of his situation began to crush him. He was a jobless construction worker against a family with a net worth that rivaled small nations. Their legal team could bury him in motions and fees, bleeding him dry until he was nothing but a cautionary tale. He was a felon now. The word felt alien, a brand seared into his identity. Hours bled into a grey, hopeless morning. He was processed, photographed, and fingerprinted like a common criminal. The questions were perfunctory, the assumption of his guilt hanging in the air. When a guard finally came to his cell, Leo expected to be transferred to a more permanent holding facility. "Vance," the guard grunted, unlocking the door. "You made bail." Leo stared at him, confused. Bail. His bank account held less than $1,000. This had to be another one of their games, a way to humiliate him further. He was led to the front desk, expecting to see one of the Finch family's lawyers with another contract to sign, another offer to disappear. Instead, he saw a small, familiar figure standing nervously by the exit, clutching a worn handbag. It was Maria. Her eyes, red-rimmed from crying, found his. She rushed to him, her relief so palpable it was a physical force. "Mr. Vance, Leo, thank God," she whispered, her voice trembling. "I was so worried." Leo was speechless. "Maria, how? Why are you here? The bail?" "I paid it," she said simply, as if it were the most natural thing in the world. "It wasn't right, what they did. I couldn't let them win." The reality of her sacrifice hit him like a physical blow. "Maria, the amount, it must have been, it was everything I had," she admitted, a quiet dignity in her voice. "My savings, 30 years of it. But money is just paper." "Justice, justice for you and your mother, that is a real investment. That is a fortune that matters." Leo felt a hot shame, followed by an overwhelming wave of gratitude. This woman, who had lost her job because of him, had just given him her entire future. This single act of profound kindness, of selfless belief, was a more powerful inheritance than all the Finch dollars combined. It solidified his resolve from fragile hope into unbreakable steel. As they stood on the steps of the police station, the city's morning rush swirling around them, Maria pressed a small, folded piece of paper into his hand. "This is also for you," she said, her voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper. "While you were inside, a message came. Not to me directly. It was from a nurse at the estate, one of the few loyal to your father, not to her. He got this to her just before they sedated him heavily. He knew they were coming for you." Leo unfolded the paper. It wasn't a letter. It was a cryptic series of notes, scrawled in a weak but deliberate hand. It read, "Charter, 1948, Article 4, Section 2. Below it was a single word, "Grandfather." Back in his apartment, the note felt like the final testament of a dying king. It was a puzzle, his father's last move in a chess game he had been losing for decades. Leo sat for hours, staring at the words. Charter, 1948. What did it mean? He thought of the company, Finch Global, founded by his grandfather, a man his father had both feared and revered. He booted up his old, slow laptop. He searched for the corporate charter of Finch Global. As a major corporation, its founding documents were a matter of public record, buried deep in online business archives. He found a digitized copy of the original 1948 charter. His hands shook as he scrolled through the dense, archaic legal text to Article 4 Tau, the section on board governance and family ownership. Then he found it, Section 2. It was a relic from a different era, a morality clause written by his stern, puritanical grandfather. It stated that any family member, regardless of their position or the size of their assets, could be stripped of their voting shares and removed from the board by a majority vote if they engaged in acts of moral turpitude or committed actions that brought public scandal and disrepute to the good name of the Finch family. For decades, it had been a forgotten piece of legal history, irrelevant in the modern world of cutthroat business. But Alistair had remembered it, and in his final hours, he had given his son the key. A wave of cold, brilliant clarity washed over Leo. The embezzlement, the public slander, the very weapons Eleanor and Preston had used to destroy him were the exact acts of moral turpitude his grandfather's clause was written to punish. They thought they had framed a felon. What they had actually done was sign their own confession. They had given him the platform, the scandal, and the motive. His father hadn't just left him a clue, he had left him a loaded gun, and Leo now knew exactly how to use it. The first call he made was not to a lawyer, but to the tabloid journalist whose byline was on the most vicious of the articles. The man, a cynical hack named Fletcher, was initially dismissive, expecting a tearful denial or an angry threat. "I'm not calling to complain about your story, Mr. Fletcher," Leo said, his voice devoid of the desperation the reporter expected. "I'm calling to give you a new one, a much bigger one. I'm holding a press conference tomorrow at noon." Fletcher scoffed. "A press conference? What are you going to announce? That you're starting a GoFundMe for your legal fees?" "I'm going to announce the truth about the Finch family's capital," Leo said, letting the words hang in the air. "About where their vast fortune really goes. You painted me as a gold digger. Tomorrow, I'll show you who's really been digging. Be there. You won't want to miss it." He hung up before Fletcher could reply. He knew the man's predatory instincts would be too strong to ignore. The scent of a bigger, juicier scandal involving a billionaire family was blood in the water. Within an hour, news of the impromptu press conference was buzzing through the media world. Leo booked a small, drab conference room in a budget hotel, a deliberate choice to contrast with the Finch's world of opulence. It was a stage set for a pauper's plea. The family, of course, believed they had already won. From their marble fortress, they watched the news reports with smug satisfaction. The disgraced son was making a final, pathetic spectacle of himself. They envisioned a rambling, incoherent speech, a desperate attempt to gain public sympathy that would only cement his image as an unstable opportunist. They were preparing champagne, ready to toast to his complete and utter humiliation. They had underestimated him at every turn, and this, they were certain, would be his final, fatal mistake. The morning of the press conference, as Leo was putting on the one clean, pressed shirt he owned, the news broke. It flashed across every television screen, a banner at the bottom of every channel. Billionaire tycoon Alistair Finch dead at 72. Leo stopped, his hands frozen on his collar. He sat on the edge of his bed and watched the emotionless news anchor read a prepared statement from the family. A profound, hollow sadness washed over him. He had never gotten the chance to truly speak to his father, to look him in the eye and hear the full story, to have a single moment of real connection. The man was gone, and with him a lifetime of unanswered questions. But mixed with the grief was a new, cold clarity. His father's death wasn't the end of the fight. It was the beginning of the reckoning. It was the final signal that the time for waiting was over. This was no longer just about justice for his mother. It was about honoring the last, desperate act of a father trying to empower the son he had failed. He arrived at the hotel to a media circus. The small conference room was overflowing with reporters, cameramen, and lighting rigs. The air was thick with cynical anticipation. They looked at him as he walked to the front. A lamb to the slaughter. They saw a man who had just lost the father he never knew, and with him, any hope of a claim to the family's immense wealth. It seemed to be the final, tragic nail in his coffin. He could see it in their eyes. They were expecting a breakdown, a desperate, rambling defense from a scorned son who had just lost everything. At the Finch estate, Eleanor and Preston watched on a massive flat-screen television, glasses of champagne in hand. "This is going to be delicious," Preston sneered, taking a sip. "Watch him cry for the cameras." Leo stepped up to the simple wooden podium. The flashes of 100 cameras were a blinding, strobing assault. The cacophony of shouted questions was a roaring wave of noise. He stood there for a long moment, letting the chaos wash over him, his face a calm, unreadable mask. He looked out at the sea of cynical faces, and then he took a slow, deep breath. He did something no one in that room, or watching from their gilded cage, could have ever predicted. He didn't deny the accusations. He didn't beg for sympathy. He didn't attack their character. Instead, he leaned into the microphone, his voice steady and clear, and began to dismantle their world. "My name is Leo Vance," he began, his voice cutting through the noise and silencing the room. "The press, with the help of the Finch family, has told you a story about me. They've called me a gold digger, a con man, a vulture. They are, in part, correct. I did come for an inheritance, but it wasn't the one they thought. In the Finch mansion, Preston snorted into his champagne glass. Here it comes, the sob story. Leo paused, letting his words sink in. They told you I was arrested for breaking into my father's home and attempting to steal from his safe. This is also true. He let the reporters murmur in confusion, admitting it. What was his angle? What they failed to mention, Leo continued, his voice dropping slightly, becoming more intense, is what I found inside. He reached down and placed a single, heavy ledger on the podium. He then gestured to a large screen behind him. With a click of a remote, the screen lit up with a high-resolution scan of a page from the book. It was a transfer of $5 million from a Finch Global subsidiary to an anonymous offshore shell corporation. This, Leo announced, is the truth about the Finch family's capital. This is a record of embezzlement. For the last 7 years, while my father's health declined, his wife, Eleanor Finch, and her son, Preston Finch, have systematically siphoned over $90 million from the company my grandfather built. A collective gasp went through the room. Cameras flashed wildly. Reporters scrambled, shouting questions. In the mansion, Preston's glass slipped from his fingers and shattered on the marble floor. Eleanor's face went ashen, her perfect composure finally cracking into a mask of pure, unadulterated horror. Leo held up a hand for silence, and surprisingly, he got it. I have here, he said, tapping the ledger, irrefutable proof. Every transaction, every signature. I have already submitted copies to the SEC and the IRS. The story you thought you were covering today is over. The real story is just beginning. He let them absorb the bombshell. Then came the next shock. But I am not here to announce that I am pressing charges. The room fell silent again, a confused, electric tension in the air. What? Fletcher, the tabloid reporter, blurted out from the front row. Revenge is a shallow victory, Leo said, his eyes scanning the room. And sending them to prison would be too simple. It would not restore the honor of my mother, whose name they erased, nor would it honor the legacy of my father, whose trust they betrayed. He took a breath. Instead, I am invoking Article 4, Section 2 of the 1948 Finch Global Corporate Charter, a morality clause placed there by my grandfather, which states that any family member who brings public disrepute upon the family name shall forfeit their shares and their position within the company. The legal reporters in the room began typing furiously, their faces a mixture of shock and glee. It was a brilliant, archaic move no one could have predicted. The board will vote, Leo continued, and they will be removed. Their controlling interest, their source of power and wealth, will be transferred. To me, as my father's only biological heir, I am claiming my birthright. He paused, letting the weight of his statement settle. And now I will tell you what I intend to do with this vast fortune. I am liquidating a significant portion of my inherited assets. The mansions, the yachts, the private jets, the portfolio of stocks and bonds. And with that capital, I am launching a new organization, the Lily Foundation, named for my mother, Lily Vance, a woman they tried to erase. His voice was thick with emotion for the first time, but it was controlled, powerful. This foundation will have one mission: to provide legal and financial aid to ordinary families who have been ruined, silenced, or destroyed by the actions of the powerful and the wealthy. We will be the voice for those who have no voice. We will be the shield for those who have no defense. My mother's legacy will not be one of silence. It will be a roar of justice. The room was stunned into absolute silence. The sheer scale of his plan, the poetic justice of it, was breathtaking, but Leo wasn't finished. He looked directly into the main camera, knowing Eleanor and Preston were watching. And so, I have an offer for my stepmother and stepbrother, he said, his voice cold as ice. A path to redemption instead of a prison cell. You will publicly confess to your crimes, You will return every single stolen dollar with interest to the Lilly Foundation. And for 1 year, you will work unpaid for that foundation. You will sit across the table from the people whose lives are just like the ones you've destroyed. You will learn humility. You will learn empathy. You will learn the true cost of your greed. Do this, and I will not pursue federal charges. Refuse, and I will ensure you spend the rest of your lives contemplating your choices from behind bars. The choice is yours. It was a masterstroke, not revenge, but forced atonement. A punishment more humiliating and profound than any prison sentence. The final twist, however, came a week later in the sterile, wood-paneled office of the Finch family lawyer, Mr. Sterling. Leo was there, as were Eleanor and a broken, defeated Preston. They had accepted his terms, their public confession a global spectacle of humiliation. They were there for the formal reading of Alistair Finch's last will and testament. Mr. Sterling cleared his throat and began to read. The legal language was dense, but the conclusion was brutally simple. And all my remaining assets, including my entire personal fortune, all real estate holdings, and my full controlling interest in Finch Global, I leave to my son, Leo Vance. Eleanor let out a strangled cry. But the old will was revoked, Mr. Sterling said, looking up from the document. Mr. Finch signed a new will 4 weeks ago. To be precise, it was the afternoon after Mr. Vance first visited the estate and refused your $10 million settlement offer. The truth hit them like a physical blow. Alistair had known. He had tested his son, and Leo had passed. He had seen their greed and had secretly, decisively cut them out long before Leo ever found the ledgers. The entire scheme, the frame-up, the public smear campaign, it had all been for nothing. Mr. Sterling then produced one final item, a single, thick envelope with Leo's name written on the front in his father's weak, spidery script. Inside was not a legal document, but a handwritten letter. As Leo read, the cold, formal office faded away, and for the first time, he heard his father's true voice. The letter was a heart-wrenching confession. Alistair wrote of his deep, genuine love for Lily, a love he had been too young and too cowardly to defend against his own tyrannical father. He admitted his weakness, the crushing weight of his own inheritance, and the expectations that came with it. He wrote of the decades of regret, of searching for her, only to be blocked by his parents' influence and later by Eleanor's subtle sabotage. He confessed that he had watched Leo from afar for years, too ashamed and too ill to make contact, but filled with a quiet, desperate pride. "I saw the man you became," the letter concluded, the ink slightly blurred as if from a tear. "You became a man of character and integrity, not because of my fortune, but in spite of its absence. You have a strength that my money could never buy. Refusing that check was the proudest moment of my life because it proved you were your mother's son. This fortune, this capital, it was a prison for me. I pray that for you, it can be a key. Use it to build something that lasts. Forgive me." Leo folded the letter, the paper warm in his hands. The anger he had carried his entire life finally dissolved, replaced by a profound, aching sense of peace. He had received his true inheritance, not the billions of dollars in assets, but the truth and a father's final, desperate plea for redemption. The story does not end with Leo moving into the cold marble mansion. He never spent a single night there. Instead, he sold it, along with the entire portfolio of the family's opulent lifestyle. The vast fortune was liquidated, the stocks sold, the bonds cashed, and every last dollar of the enormous patrimony was funneled into the Lilly Foundation. The final scene of this story takes place 6 months later, not in a high-rise corporate office, but back on the familiar working-class streets where Leo grew up. He stands on a construction site, a blueprint in his hand, a comfortable layer of dust on his work boots. He's overseeing the construction of a brand new community center, the first major project funded by the foundation. It will have a free legal aid clinic, a job training facility, and a daycare for single parents. Maria is there with him, now a salaried director on the foundation's board, her life savings returned to her tenfold. Some of Leo's old co-workers are on the crew, earning double their old wages. He looks up as the sun sets, the frame of the new building silhouetted against the sky. He didn't just claim his birthright, he had completely redefined its meaning. He had found justice for his mother, peace within himself, and a purpose far greater than any amount of money. He had learned that true wealth isn't measured in dollars or the fluctuations of the stock market, but in the lives you can change and the good you can build. The abandoned son had inherited a kingdom, and his first act was to give it all away to the people. What do you think of Leo's final decision? Was it justice or something more? Let us know your thoughts in the comments below. And if you were moved by this story of redemption and purpose, make sure to like this video and subscribe for more content that will inspire you. Thank you for watching.